And as Michelle mentioned, I'm the current affairs curator at TED, and a very proud Rutgers alum. Graduated from Douglas College in 2007, and I really credit my experience at Rutgers with so much of who I am, and just feel really honored to be back here with you guys today, and excited to share some of the things from my work that might be helpful for you as you do your own work. And so this webinar is called TED Tips for Public Speaking, and the goal is to really try and impart some of the wisdom as a curator at TED that might help you be a better public speaker, both in the classroom with your professor and beyond, and then of course for students as well, just in any sort of space where you do speak publicly. I think that there are a lot of tips that we relate to our speakers at TED that are not just unique to giving a TED Talk, but can be used in really any forum. So before we do that, though, I think I'd love to launch into, sort of the who I am and a little bit more about TED. And I'm actually going to share my screen here. And I think once I do that, I won't be able to see many of your faces or the Zoom screen. So feel free to chat any questions or comments that you have. I'll save some time at the end for us to engage and talk through anything, but I may not see them as they're coming up. So Michelle, if you see anything that feels urgent, please feel free to chime in.
Will do.
Thank you. Okay. So let me share my screen here. Okay, and so I imagine everyone can see this first slide here. If I don't hear anything, I'm going to just keep going forward and assume that it's visible. So as I mentioned, TED Talks, I think a lot of people are familiar with TED, but for those of you who are not, we are a global media organization that was started in 1984, originally just as an intimate event series where people would come together to give talks on areas in which they were an expert, largely focused around technology, entertainment, and design, which is TED. Some people think that TED is a person, but in fact, it's an acronym for those three things. And that they continue to kind of be a cornerstone of a lot of the talks that we curate. But these were really intimate gatherings that then expanded into an annual conference that reached about 800 people every year who would come together to hear people share their expertise on different subject areas. And in 2006, our head, who continues to be the head of TED, Chris Anderson, had a bold idea to put the talks from this conference online. And that really sort of changed the shape of TED and became the organization that I think many of us know it to be now, where you can see these talks that originate at these events and conferences anywhere in the world for free. Shortly thereafter, the license for TED was offered to independent organizers around the world. And those are the TEDx events that I'm sure many of you have seen or even been to. I know Rutgers has hosted some TEDx events. And those events are oftentimes, even though they're not curated by us at TED headquarters, are often, some of the best talks that we've ever had have come out of these TEDx events and really show the ideas and the issues that matter most to people all over the world. And so, I think the thing that you see now is that the talks that originate on these conferences, that's where things start, but really in thinking about how we amplify our message and get these ideas out there, we have so much to thank to TED.com and YouTube and being able to share messaging far and wide in this way. We have at this point thousands of videos that have been posted on our website and YouTube. Some of our top videos, as you're seeing a few of them here, have amassed tens of millions of views and more than 1 billion views of all of our content. And at this point, we're really proud to have a global audience of about 110 million people around the world who are watching our content every single day. And so, I think that as you're seeing this and you're thinking about these talks and how they live on our website and how they come to be, you may be wondering what exactly is a TED curator. So I, again, am the current affairs curator, and I'm part of a team at TED of roughly 10 curators who work in different specialties. So we have a science curator, a design curator, a business curator, and then my role is sort of overlaps all of those things and looking for talks that feel like they are responding to issues of the moment, are more timely and have more of an urgency to them, but do tend to fall into all those buckets. And basically this team, my team of curators, we're basically tasked with going out and finding some of the smartest, most thoughtful voices in the world, and working with them to develop these talks that tend to be about 10 to 15 minutes in length, sometimes even shorter. And this is a process that takes place over the course of several months and sometimes even years, from the moment that we decide we want to reach out to somebody, begin to have those conversations, and then go through this very lengthy process of scripting and editing, re-scripting, re-editing. We have speaker coaching, rehearsing that happens. It's a very collaborative experience, and we're workshopping really with each speaker to develop a talk that feels really true to them, authentic, and also delivers a message in a way that's really clear, concise, and that feels impactful. It's a level of intensity developing these TED Talks that I think a lot of people have said, especially people who are public speakers as part of their job. We find that we often are inviting people who are politicians or media professionals or, spend lots of time giving talks publicly. And they've said that this process, that this TED experience is much more rigorous and involved. And really for us, what the aim of going through this extensive edit process and talk development process is to try and create a talk that feels engaging, persuasive, and ultimately potentially life-altering. I think that's always the goal for us, is that we feel like this is an opportunity to share an idea and a message that feels fresh, that could maybe change one person's life, lots of people's lives, to change the world to make it better. And, I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, there are lots of tips that we relay to our speakers that are specific to TED, but I think there are many things that you can take from the experience of developing a TED Talk and apply to lots of areas in your life as a speaker, both publicly or, to really small groups. And so I have sort of distilled some of these ideas down to 5 tips that I think we'll go through individually, but I think these really sort of encapsulate a lot of the things that we share with all of our speakers. And so you start with an idea, create a narrative thread, give a gift to the audience, less is usually more, and learn, don't memorize. And so we'll break all of those down bit by bit, and we can discuss afterward, any questions you might have about it. But I think if you have these sort of 5 elements as you're thinking about developing a presentation or a talk, it will help to make it feel much easier for folks to grasp and keep your audience much more engaged. So the first thing is start with an idea. And at TED, our tagline is ideas worth spreading. And that reason is because we find that the most engaging talks often offer some sort of fresh and new idea or perspective that improves something that the audience member cares about, whether that's, helping them to have better time management or solving global hunger. It ranges the gamut, but always starts with this nugget of an idea or a solution to a problem that is widely felt by people. And I think that that's something that, in a lot of ways, it feels like that makes a lot of sense, but is unique to a lot of the presentations and talks that people give. We often see that people are really fixated on, there's this huge issue out there, and I want to raise awareness about it. And so a lot of times, if you really pay attention to speaking you see on television, whether it's like watching cable news, that there often is this highlighting around the problem itself, and not always a solution connected to that. And at TED, again, as we're looking at how we can make things feel life-altering, we find that focusing on an idea and focusing on a solution, it ends up being something that engages the audience member more, because it feels like, this is what I've come here to get from you. This is something that I'm gaining from this experience, more than just an understanding of an issue, but how can I actually see that issue resolved? And so before we invite a speaker, we always try and clarify this idea. And that's, whether it's a president of a country down to somebody who's invented something in their garage, a name is important, but we're always trying to think about what is the actual idea that this person is sharing that feels new and fresh. And ultimately, the hope is that in developing the talk, the idea becomes more than half of what you're presenting, that you really are leaning into this idea and leaning into the solution, so that feels like the thing that keeps the viewer listening to hear, okay, what's this new thing that you're going to share? So once you have an idea, creating a narrative thread is the natural next point for us in talk development. And I think that this narrative thread is a way to make whatever you're saying more engaging, because you make it very visual. And so it's the idea that you would use a story to sort of illustrate the problem, and then immediately thread it to your solution, so that the viewer, the audience member, understands that, okay, here's the thing that I'm going to give to you that we're going to solve for this problem. I think if you're giving a talk on a subject, or you're speaking on something, you're some level of an expert on that. This is an area in which you feel comfortable speaking. You probably have data points. Maybe you've done research in this area. And of course, all of that is really important. And we really want to stress that we try and keep the data central to whatever it is that the talk is focused around, but that it's the storytelling that really keeps the viewer staying with you and engaged through the whole talk. And so an example of this is, recently I worked on a talk with a speaker who was trying to link the need for racial justice and climate action together, and show that the two were connected to one another. And so, he's a politician in the UK, and a lot of his work, was focused around working with communities of color there. And so rather than start to give the data points about how, the climate crisis impacts communities of color in disproportionate ways, and all of that is important and was definitely a big part of his talk. He started by telling individual stories about what his experiences were like working in his community in London, talking about experiences he's had in different other parts of the world where he's actually seen the way that the climate crisis impacted that community. And I think hearing that, it catches you a little bit sooner than to say, 1 million people around the world, and this is a number I'm making up, are impacted in this way by climate change. It's much easier to, I think, to grab people with something that feels personal, that they can actually connect to. And then what you do is, throughout the talk, you sort of try and return to that narrative thread. You keep coming back to these stories and these examples to illustrate whatever it is, the data is that you're presenting, whatever points that may feel a lot duller for the audience, to keep them engaged and to help them to really put, in many ways, a face to a number, right? And so, I keep talking about this idea of giving the audience something through this idea. And basically the feeling that we have is that, the audience has given you their attention, right? They've taken the time to listen to you, whether it's in person, showing up to an event, or virtually logging on. Like right now, you guys have logged on to listen to this webinar, and you could be doing anything else. And right now we live in the attention economy, where there are a million ways you could be spending your time at any given moment. And so the gift that you give to the audience is that you have come here to give me your attention, and in return, I'm going to offer you something that's going to actually help you in your life, that may improve something for you. And this is really embedded in the idea that you share, is basically, how can I take this idea, no matter how big or how small it is, and apply it to my own life? How can I take clear, actionable steps to take this idea or solution that you're offering through your message, and make it better for me, or where I can actually be involved. So, in some cases, if you are offering, if your idea is a program, for instance, like maybe it's how can an audience member replicate that program for them in their own worlds, in their own communities. If you've created an invention, it's how can the audience member support that invention that you've created. If you have just a solution to a big problem, how can the audience member take the solution that maybe you've applied in your life and then take it and use it in their own. And I think that making sure that it feels like, sometimes it is a list of, here are 3 ways that you can take these things and use them for yourself, just making sure that it's always really very clear and feels really broad, that it's something that, whether it's a child listening or, a CEO of an organization, that it feels something that anyone in any place can take for themselves. And that is really the gift that you give the audience as in return for their attention to you during your talk. The other thing, and this is something that as you notice with TED Talks, so they're shorter. So the longest TED Talks at one point were ranging up to 20 minutes. And now, especially since the pandemic has started, we're seeing that our talks are coming in more in the 10, 15 minute range max. And honestly, even we've had talks that are 5 or 6 minutes that we found are really impactful. And so, a lot of this, going back to this idea of the audience is giving you their attention, we find that people just have diminishing attention spans. There's so much content out there. There's so many things that they can be doing. So the ability to say what you need to say succinctly, quickly, is really, really important to making your message have an impact. So the big point is that, as you're scripting your talk or thinking about what to say, that you're really making sure that every word is in service of whatever the big idea is that you're presenting, and being critical about that, if I'm going to spend 5 minutes talking about this sub-subject, how does that help with my bigger message? If my bigger message is to, clean the oceans, how does this actually help me tell that message? And you review your talk again and again to sort of look for that redundancy, to look for ways that you can trim the fat, if you will, from your talk. And that is part of this process that I described earlier, where we are going over, over several months with speakers over their talks and really looking at, okay, this doesn't help and this doesn't add to what it is you're trying to say, and, getting different voices and perspectives in there. We often have, for any given talk, at least 5-6 people who look at a talk, sometimes double that number. And I think that that's helpful also for anyone who's going to give a presentation on something, to ask for other people's perspective, because there's oftentimes things that you might miss that you feel like, I thought that this added something that it actually doesn't. And this rule also applies to visuals and images. I think we at TED are of the mindset that less is usually more when it comes to this, unless it is a talk about art or something where not seeing the visuals will not help you better understand the message. But as a rule, we try to use visual aids only when they actually add something that your words can't. So, in some cases it's, here, for instance, I'm using visuals to punctuate what it is I'm saying, and to keep us focused on this is what this subject is at this moment. But, I think seeing word by word what I'm actually saying to you listed out there often is not helpful to the talk, takes the focus away from you as a speaker, and makes the talk feel move along less quickly and less engaging. And the final point that we really try and emphasize is this idea of learning, don't memorize. So over several months, by the time you finish the scripting process with a TED Talk, we have usually word for word what you could say. And you could easily get up there and look at your paper and just read from your page, or you can memorize every single and the and or and every single word. But then that ends up feeling less riveting for an audience member. And so we really try to approach TED Talks as talks or conversations and not speeches. It's meant to feel more natural and more engaging. And so rather than remembering every single word and getting tripped up about things that, that you forgot that sentence, instead it's better to sort of think about your talk in chunks, that this is the idea you want to share in this paragraph, and remembering that this is the story that you want to share, the natural arc of that story. And that ends up feeling much more like a natural way to speak to people. And, I often describe it as like thinking about meeting up with a friend over coffee. Like you wouldn't take out a piece of paper and start reading a story to them, and you think about your audience in that way as if you were meeting with friends over coffee. Maybe that's, 10 friends, maybe it's a few hundred friends or 1,000 friends, depending on who the audience is. But that feels like it's a much more comfortable way and relaxed way for the audience to receive your message. And for you, ultimately, you end up coming across much more authentic and relatable. And so those are sort of the big 5 things that I think, of course, we approach every speaker differently. We approach every talk differently. And there are, needs that every person might have depending on what it is that what speech that it is that they're giving. But I think these are rules that you can apply to any talk that you might give, to anything that you might focus on in delivering, whether it is, again, in the classroom or beyond. That can really help make your message feel a lot sharper and more engaging. So those are the big points that I wanted to share. And of course, as I mentioned, there are lots of other places questions that people might have, or areas that you feel I hadn't covered in this, that I'd love to take some time to answer any questions people might have, or go over anything that maybe wasn't really super clear. And I see you can feel free to chime in if you have questions that you want to ask, or you can ask them in the chat here. And I'm happy to also share anything, whether it's not even related directly to this, but about my work at TED as well.
Hi, my name is Tracy Davis. I really liked your presentation, and thank you for taking the time to speak to us. I was doing a little bit of multitasking and I missed the first point that you had. If you could repeat that, I'd greatly appreciate it.
Sure. So the first point was just around making sure you have an idea. And a lot of this, stems from our tagline is ideas worth spreading, because we believe that the idea is what makes a talk more engaging and interesting and valuable for the audience member. So rather than focus on the problem and just highlighting an issue that you see in the world, think about how you can present something new and fresh as far as solutions go that actually fixes that problem, and have that be the cornerstone of your talk and the thing that you're constantly leaning into. Ultimately, I think that a good talk really ends up having more than half of the talk focus on a solution, and you highlight the problem sort of quickly and move on to, but here's how we could fix it.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, so Matthew McQuillan has asked, Whitney, can you offer a few tips for delivering, and hi Matthew, can you offer a few tips for delivering a speech via Zoom or other web platform, especially if you're used to feeding off the energy from a live group you can see? This is a great question, and I feel like it's something that we've struggled with at TED this year, and I'm sure everyone has with the pandemic. We have fortunately moved all of our conferences that used to be live and in person online, and record a lot of these talks via Zoom. And I think the thing that we've found is it does depend on the speaker. In some cases, people will simulate an audience. They'll have a group of people join on Zoom in one window while they're delivering their presentation in the other. So even though you're not in the room, you're at least seeing faces, you're seeing smiles, you're seeing nods, and you're getting that sort of reaction. In other cases, we try and ask people to sort of mentally imagine themselves in a room. It's sort of playing this game of imagining yourself naked in front of people, but instead just imagining yourself in front of people, period. And I think that is something that makes a difference for some folks. And then I think really, as far as for the audience, the way that they can feel the difference between you just sitting in your office or your living room or wherever you are, is really trying to keep that eye line instead of with the video screen, but with the actual camera lens. I think that people can feel, even through Zoom or whatever video platform you're using, when your eyes are looking directly at them, it makes a difference, and it feels less like you're just sitting in a Zoom call. But that is definitely a challenge. Those are some tips that have worked for us. Let me see. So Yabo Besolo, and I'm sorry if I've mispronounced your name. He asked about the narrative thread, or she, excuse me. What are other options if you do not have a story necessarily? And so I think this is a good thing to ask when if the issue that you're highlighting is not personal to you, right? That you're like, well, I didn't personally experience hunger and I'm giving a talk about hunger. And so I think that in thinking about the story, it doesn't necessarily need to be a personal story, but I think it's more so thinking about how can you show whatever problem or issue you're illustrating in a way that actually connects it to the real world. And if you can't connect it to the real world, then I think the question is this actually an actual problem, right? So, you know, something that you can think about is, it may mean like if you have data on, you know, the number of countries that have experienced a tsunami, right? Then it's going in to figure out, okay, well, let me find, you know, one story of like one example of a country that's experienced a tsunami and find out more information about what that impact was like for that community. And that may be information that's accessible to you through the internet without having actually experienced it, without actually having been there. It's just finding some way that you can create some sort of visual element that brings what you're saying to life. Okay, let me see. Emily Barrett asks, do you have tips for making impactful PowerPoint slides to accompany a talk? And I mean, I think that this sort of ties into the less is more elements of the tips, where it's sort of thinking about I think you craft your talk before you craft your PowerPoint slides. And then you're basically using the PowerPoint slides to fill in gaps that you couldn't say with your talk. I think there's a lot of times people use PowerPoint slides as a crutch in a way where it's like, okay, I'm not gonna remember what I have to say. So if I have it all written down on the slide, then I can just turn to the slide. But the reality is, if it's all written down on the slide, then you don't really need to be there to begin with, right? The audience could just look at your slides and that's the presentation. So I think instead, if it's like, if you're saying a statistic at some point during your talk, maybe you put that number or that information on the slide because that's really important. Or if you're, you know, telling a story about something, you show an image of that person or that experience that helps to give the audience something additional that they wouldn't have just from what you're saying. But I think that the key is that, you know, making your talk impactful is that it's about you. You know, you want the audience to connect with you. And the best way that they can do that is by talking with them one-on-one and using any sort of visual aids as just that, as aids. So Derek Shandell asks, what is your goal length time for a TEDx talk? Sometimes students ask us to use TED Talks in class. For example, a type of video for online discussion boards conducted during a class session or asynchronously over a weekend after this week's class meeting. Many TEDx talks are long. My experience is using videos of 3 to 6 minute long work best. And you know, this is something that's actually been evolving a lot at TED. As I mentioned initially, some of our talks were in the 20-minute range. We have talks that are 25 minutes long, and who has 25 minutes to listen to anybody talk about anything these days, right? That's a long time. And you know, we found that we've had talks, especially in the past couple of months, that have been in the 5-minute range that have been done so well online that people have responded really positively to. And I think we really are trying to get our talks shorter. So right now, 10 minutes feels like the right length, but it really does vary too. You know, there's some things that you can't cover in 10 minutes. And there's some things that you shouldn't, you know, that 25 minutes feels like just entirely too long. And I think most things. And so the big part of this is really trying to be critical and thoughtful about what you're saying. So I think if, as you're delivering a message or coming up with an idea for a talk, going through it again and again and again, having someone else look at it to give you feedback will be really helpful in figuring out, you know what, like I thought I needed to say this in 10 minutes, but I can actually do it in 7 because I don't need to say this whole paragraph here, is really going to be helpful in getting the length down for a lot of what you share. And let's see, Victoria Abrara asks, can you give us some tips on how to structure long seminars like 30 to 45 minutes, which is the standard seminars that a lot of us give at conferences? Yeah, so I mean, I think, and of course, this is to this point about how, you know, what's the good length for a talk, and in some cases you don't really get a choice, right? You get 30 minutes, you get 45 minutes, so you need to sort of try and fill that time. And I actually just am of the feeling that, you know, there's no reason to just stretch things out. If you've said what you need to say in 20 minutes, then I think you use the rest of the time to give people an opportunity to ask questions or to engage and to maybe to dive deeper into something that you might have shared, or you just finish early. And I know that that's sometimes not what people want, but I often feel like there's no reason to just fill space just for the sake of doing it. And I think that you sort of approach it in the same way of thinking about what is the actual idea that you're sharing, and how can you present points that are sort of in service of that idea. And over the course of a 30-minute seminar, you might have several ideas, and I think that's okay. And that's a struggle, I think, with a lot of times with talks, the TED Talks that we put on, because they're a lot shorter, that we only have time for one idea. And some speakers are like, but I have this idea, and I have this idea, and I have this idea. And we really try and like, let's just focus on this one for this one talk. But if you have more time, there's an opportunity to really hit several ideas, and maybe making that clear from the beginning that during the first 10 minutes, we're going to focus on this idea, then we're going to focus on that idea, then we're going to focus on this idea, and really trying to keep each of those contained, and thinking about them as, instead of one long 30-minute talk, maybe 3 or 4 short talks. And Jaya Sadagopan asks, do you have any tips on how to avoid And I say and I use filler words. And I think that, the best way to do it, and this is really just thinking about being more conversational, is that I feel that when you get in public and you're speaking, and I think in a setting like this where I'm speaking to an audience that, one, I can't see all of you, and then also I'm the only one really talking, right? So there's a lot of opportunity for me to use filler words and to try and sometimes just to even catch my breath to say something in place of the next thing that I plan to say. And I think that if you approach things in a more conversational way, I find that filler words tend to fall off, so that you are not using them as often. And if you have a roadmap, you often are not using as many filler words as well. So that I think sometimes the filler comes from the nervousness of, okay, now what do I say? Whereas if you know exactly where you're going, if you've scripted this out, if you've taken the time to develop the talk, there's less anxiety around that, and there's more clarity about the next step in what you're saying. And then, of course, total honesty with TED Talks, we edit our talks. And so a lot of times people, if they struggle with these filler words, that is something that you often won't see when you watch, is all the ahs and ums, because we cut a lot of them out. But I think that, just trying to approach things more naturally and speak in your more natural voice really helps with a lot of those filler. And then I see someone else also like I see the question again about speakers that don't have the ums, and that's just the magic of editing. And Claire Brown, she asks, can you recommend any additional resources from TED or other organizations like Toastmasters that might be helpful for our students who are looking to practice or build their public speaking skills for class, job, interviews, etc.? So I think I've gone to some Toastmasters events years ago, and I think that they're great. And, I think the thing with TED, and this is something that we as an organization, when we think about who to invite to the stage, is we're not looking at people who have public speaking experience. We're not even looking for people who are quote unquote good public speakers. The big issue is whether or not they have an idea that they actually want to share. And we believe that public speaking, the skills that you need to get up and deliver a message, can be trained and taught. And I feel like practice more than anything is really helpful with being able to develop and build those skills. And I think that, separate from an organization or a training or a class you can take, just putting yourself in a position where you're forcing yourself, if public speaking is something that scares you, makes you uncomfortable, where you're putting yourself in a position to do that more often. And I think that there's no better way to become comfortable doing it than by just actually going out there and doing it. So I would encourage any students who feel like, this is something that they want to do more of, but they're really nervous, to just challenge yourself to find opportunities, whether it is just standing up in class and giving a presentation, or becoming part of some organization where you have an opportunity to speak to a group, to do that and become comfortable in knowing that, you're going to make mistakes. Maybe you won't hit it out the park the first time. You probably won't. And that's fine. And I think that there's a huge element of public speaking that puts us in other people's heads, that people are staring at you and you think, well, what must they be thinking in this moment? And oftentimes people aren't thinking, the things that you think they're thinking. They're not thinking about the fact that maybe you've said a few times. They're not thinking about, maybe that your shirt is a little wrinkled or whatever it is that might be concerning you in that moment. They're often, if you are approaching it from a way of you're looking to engage with the audience, you're coming at it from a conversational place, you've prepared exactly what you want to say, that they're more focused on you and the message than any of the little errors and things that that you might be thinking about. So I think a lot of it is a mental game and trying to get out of your own head and just getting out there and doing it. Let me see. So Liz asks, oh, I'm sorry, this is more of a point than a question. Okay. I think I might have seen most of the questions. Oh, okay, so Vince Silenzio asks, do you have tips for making the narrative more suspenseful or engaging, even when the story itself may be otherwise unknown? I think this is so interesting, and I feel like we have some talks where we do try and make it more suspenseful, and we sort of tell the first part of the story and then come back to it later, and and turns out that person, she lived in the end, or whatever the case is. And I think that that works in some cases. In other cases, it feels kind of like a gimmick, right? That you're like keeping the audience here for something that maybe they might have already figured out early on. And I honestly, I think depending on, it really has a lot to do with you personally. Like, I think for some people that suspensefulness, it does come across in a way that doesn't feel authentic to who that person is as a speaker. And I don't know that suspense is always the goal. Instead, it's just like, can you tell like just a really an interesting story that helps you make your point? So if you're giving a talk about poverty, right? It's you're sometimes the data points itself are shocking. Like, can you believe that there are this many people who are experiencing this? And then you tell a personal story about somebody who's gone through this to help illustrate that point. And I think that sometimes the suspense is not even necessary. It feels like the audience is already interested in the point that you've shared. They're already wanting to know more about that specific data point. And so I think that you shouldn't always approach it in a way where you're looking to make things more suspenseful, but if it feels like a natural way to tell the story, then I think that that's the right approach. And I think it's more about figuring out what feels natural to you and how you share something, what feels engaging. And then again, this whole idea of testing it out with other people, letting other people read what it is you might want to, it is you're going to present, to give feedback on whether they felt like, oh, I would have loved to know that earlier instead of waiting to share it at the end, or how people receive the talk. Laura asks, any advice for faculty who are teaching a 2-hour time block to use the TED Tips for a lecture? And and I think this is similar to this idea of like if you're giving a 30 to 45 minute seminar, or rather a 30 to 45 minute talk at a conference or something, that you can approach it in parts where you're thinking about, rather than giving one long 30-minute talk, you're thinking of, okay, here are 3 short 10-minute talks that I'm giving, and they're each focused on individual ideas. I also think, of course, with like a lecture, you have an opportunity to engage with your students, and in a way that sometimes with a set talk, it's not meant to be actually engaging them where they have an opportunity to speak back or to talk back with you. So I think that trying to incorporate that in there too, if you begin to feel like, okay, I've now getting tired of hearing the sound of my own voice and have been talking for, 30, 45 minutes, to have that natural break where other people get to speak, I think is always really welcomed, and not just by you, because it gives you a chance to take a break, but also I think for the audience, they enjoy an opportunity to hear from other voices. So that's something I would employ. And then I do believe, I think that sometimes we put these parameters on ourselves, like we have to do this in 2 hours or 90 minutes or whatever the case is. And if you can say what you need to say in 75 minutes, I'm of the mindset to do it in 75 minutes and then give people 15 minutes back, or, to give the time back to folks. And I think people really appreciate that. And they leave feeling more impacted and connected to the message that you shared. And Derek Shandell asks, is there a preferred PowerPoint slide color scheme for TED Talks and pre-recorded class or conference presentations of 10 to 12 minutes versus in-person presentation? And no, there isn't. I mean, I think it really is, it's about your style and the way that you feel like the messaging stands out most. that serves whatever idea it is that you're looking to share. And I think that that's really an opportunity for you to sort of show your own personality. So there's definitely no color scheme. I mean, of course, for TED, like our color is red. So we do a lot of things in red, but that's not a hard and fast rule. And I think that you should approach everything you do sort of in thinking about like what works really well for this presentation and works well for this idea. And so I think I've gone through all the questions that people have shared, but I wanted to also give people an opportunity to share any experiences that they've had with public speaking, that maybe tips that I haven't offered that maybe you found to be really helpful in your own experiences as you've done this, that might be helpful for the group. I think that is always really great to hear. I'm this is the work that I do day in and day out, but of course, like I don't know everything. And I think that there's lots to be learned from each other. So if anyone has any tips that they would like to share, I think that would be great to hear as well.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
How do you go about when you're presenting and at the end of your presentation or your TED Talk, the audience is allowed to ask questions and someone asks you a question and you have no idea how to answer it?
Yeah.
Or like how do you go around answering a question that you might not necessarily have the answer to, but you don't want to kind of look unprofessional or that you don't know what you're talking about?
Right. I mean, I honestly think being honest, right? That there's no reason to pretend like you know something that you don't. It doesn't help. It doesn't make you look better. It doesn't help the audience or the person asking the question become more knowledgeable on the subject. And I think, to maybe offer instead, it's like, I don't know that specific question that you've asked, but if there's something else that's kind of related, or if there's some personal experience that you've had that feels like this may not be the exact right answer, but this is what I personally have gone through. I just think that the whole idea around talks that feel impactful is that authenticity and that feeling that the audience can trust you. And so I think I would definitely avoid anything that might jeopardize that trust, and coming up with something off the top of your head that doesn't actually isn't based in any experiences that you've had is not a way to go with that. So honesty is always the way to go, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Karen, about the using images to communicate a feeling. I think that's really important with slides. And I think like one thing I want to say too is and I'm not totally against the idea of slides. Obviously I use slides, and we often tell our speakers to try and avoid using too many slides if they can. But I feel like there are instances where it really does help to have something up there, even if it is just a picture. It makes people more connected. Well, I don't want to, keep folks if there aren't any other questions. I don't know if Michelle, if you had anything you wanted to add, but I feel like these questions have been really amazing, and it's been wonderful to hear also some of your own feedback on the presentation. But I again, to my point of like feeling like once you said what you need to say, I'm good with sort of just moving on from that. And so I think if there aren't other questions, there actually is.
One more, yeah.
There's one more here. What do you think about the use of green screens for Zoom presentations? I think it depends on the nature of the presentation or of the talk. That I think that there's some instances where it is when it's more lighthearted or if it is more casual, that I love seeing people on the beach while they're giving their presentation. But I also think that to the point of authenticity, like there's something really nice, and this is something I've actually really enjoyed about the way that we've been doing our talks now at TED, about seeing someone at home, or seeing someone, in a space that sort of speaks to what they're talking about. Like, we've had scientists deliver talks in their lab, which is something when we were giving talks live, you wouldn't have that opportunity. Everybody's on the stage. And so I think that you can sort of use your setting and your environment as part of your talk, as part of what you're saying, and if it contributes something to the authenticity of who you are and what you're saying in your message.
All right. Well, Whitney, thank you so much for doing this. And I think, on behalf of everybody who joined today, this was incredibly informative. And I will be sharing the recording with everybody. So if anybody wants to kind of go back, miss the first part of it, I know we had a few people join us a little bit later. I'll get it out to everybody. But please join me in thanking Whitney in the chat box. And you can also find her on Twitter, right?
Right, I'm on Twitter at WhitPennRod, and so feel free to reach out. And it was so great to be here. Thank you, Michelle. Thanks to the School of Public Health, and thank you all for joining and for your wonderful questions. I really appreciated it and enjoyed this experience. And good luck.